and welcome to We Never Met, the podcast where I have interesting strangers on every single week. Today we have Ben Edmunds. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So just to give people a little background on who you are, just to start off before we get into it, could you give a little background on what you do now?
Yeah, I'm the brewmaster and co-owner, or one of the co-owners of Breakside Brewery in Portland, Oregon.
Where did you grow up? Did you grow up in Oregon or no?
No, I'm like many current residents of the Northwest. I'm a Midwest transplant. I grew up outside of Detroit.
Okay, sure. And at a young age, were you exposed to the brewing scene at all, or was this something that came on like later in life for you?
No, not at all. I mean, not until I was, 19, 20, 21. I mean, I don't think, I know I'm supposed to jokingly say, I never had a beer until I was 21, but I don't think I actually had a beer really until I was like 18. So it's not something like, my parents were not into craft beer or anything like that. We definitely were into like food. And so like that was probably where the seeds of the interest began. But yeah, no, brewing came to me as in college and beyond.
Yeah. Cause I mean, at that age too, I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So beer is a big part of my upbringing for sure, yeah. But you're not drinking anything refined at 18, so I doubt it sparked anything great for you.
I think also Wisconsin has a very distinct like kind of tavern culture that I think a lot of people get introduced to at a younger age that, even in I spent a lot of time in Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota, and it doesn't seem like it exists outside of Wisconsin. There's the arm's length rule, right? Where you can be in a bar as long as you're within arm's length of your parents.
Yeah, which is an odd thing for sure, I think. But yeah, it's just part of the culture there. So growing up in that area, what were you planning on doing? Like when you were in high school, did you want to go to college for something and pursue a career afterwards?
I didn't really know at the time. Both through high school and then college, I flirted with the idea of going into academia and getting like a PhD. Both my parents were trained lawyers, so going to law school was always kind of a little bit of family pressure to do that, but not too much. Obviously, not that much. My first career after college was as an educator, and so definitely have like a history of teaching in my family. And so, there was nothing clear at that point, and certainly not brewing. I
mean, they are your own parents, but was it intimidating having two parents that were both lawyers? Like going into school, did you have like a very, I guess, expectation of really high achieving?
Definitely there were high expectations for sure. But I think maybe more than anything, having parents as lawyers or lawyers as parents, lawyers as parents is, it's made me very difficult to argue with as a boss.
Yeah, I can imagine, having that confrontation from a very young age.
Yeah.
You talked about this a little bit or alluded to a little bit, but when did you first start actually getting interested in this more of just like not just drinking beer, but like, oh, I might want to create this?
My kind of progression was similar to, I think, what a lot of people go through, which is that the first thing you get interested in is the flavor, good beer itself, right? I mean, so it's by consumption a little bit. But I got really interested in like brewing as like brew pubs and breweries by way of, again, kind of like being interested in like local foods movements. And it seemed to me that brew pubs, pretty much anywhere I would travel, and I was going to school on the East Coast and I was spending summers in the Midwest and this is, 2000, 2005, like in that kind of range, 2000, 2005, the early aughts, that many towns didn't have a lot in terms of like there wasn't a lot of emphasis on local in terms of dining, in terms of kind of craftsmanship at that point. But brew pubs were the exception to that. And you could go to like small towns across the country, even, at that time, 15, 20 years ago, and find a brew pub. And it was kind of a hub, like a local institution, oftentimes in old historic buildings. And so there was this connection to kind of the place and the past and the creation of new foodstuffs on site. And so that really intrigued me. And I think that's kind of where my interest in craft brewing began, was really about how brew pubs were this kind of hub of a community, this very kind of central place, place-based place. And then, of course, the beer itself caught my imagination after that.
Yeah, because, I mean, there's for sure a huge difference between like being interested in something and then actually starting a business around that thing, So what like pushed you to actually want to like create a business around something that you were really interested in?
I should first say it was a 10-year progression, right? Going from kind of initial interest to becoming a professional in the industry. And I guess that would look like, it went from being kind of vaguely interested in beer and brew pubs as like a kind of aside to like local foods, to being interested in the craft of brewing itself, wanting to know more about the beers and getting into home brewing eventually. And then getting kind of caught with that bug. And that's like a whole stage that I think a lot of people who go into the beer industry ultimately, people who come into it like as entrepreneurs or who just get kind of bit by the bug and want to become brewers, start as home brewers, and then realizing that, maybe there's an opportunity to take that hobby that's, quasi obsessive and turning it into a career that could be really enjoyable and sustainable.
Talking about that, when did you start like home brewing and stuff? And because there's an interesting thing. I've talked to a lot of brewers and brewery owners, and there's such like a interesting jump from like creating beer in your basement. I mean, it doesn't have to be in your basement, wherever, to massively scaling all these recipes and creating like, huge batches and learning how to package things and things like that. So where did that all start for you? When did you actually start home brewing?
Probably, I think it's funny. I don't remember exactly when my first batch of beer was brewed, but I want to say it was probably 2003 or 2004. It was those after college when I moved to Leadville, Colorado. I lived there for a small mountain town for about 4.5 years that I really got into it. I had a friend who had a kit, and he was kind of more of an engineer type. He was a software engineer who was working from home, and he was really into the kind of the technical like gadgetry side. And I was really into the like flavor development, recipe design side and brewing process. And so together we were a pretty good team. And I think we brewed more beer, at home than the local brew pub did all year. So
did you give it to, or did you like give it to friends and family? Did you try to get it into bars and stuff?
No. Purely recreational, purely hobbyist. We had a fleet of like 8 kegs and a kegerator, 820 kegs that people could come, have one of the beers.
What was the general response from people that were drinking it when you first started?
I mean, people are always so enthusiastic. It's like you're even halfway decent at making beer. I think that like at the homebrew level, I think people are just happy that it doesn't taste terrible. They're not, and it's free. So they're excited about that,
Because at Breakside now, you do so many different styles and so many different types of beer. Was that true for you at the beginning too? Were you interested in trying to learn all the different styles, all the different types?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think that goes back to that brew pub concept where it's like, I love brew pubs in part because they were generalists. Like you could walk in a brew pub in 2005, and it's changed a little bit since then, but like the classic American brew pub, and you had this full spectrum of color and flavor from very pale light beer to stout. And there was something for everyone, and I was always enamored of that idea and still am. So we try and at Breakside cast a big tent approach. We're generalists for sure. And that was true in home brewing too.
Like when you first got into it, because when you were in Colorado, you were teaching high school, right? Is that what you're doing? Right. It was sort of like you were teaching high school by day, creating beer by night, sort of beer superhero kind of thing. What traits did you think you took from teaching and like basically learning how to communicate with people and teach people concepts to brewing beer? Is there a crossover there for you?
Certainly in managing a brewery and in terms of building kind of community and building a team. And those are all things that you're doing as a teacher. If you're a good manager in the classroom of high schoolers, of 15 to 18-year-olds, like you're learning strategic ways to get buy-in, establish rapport, establish and maintain expectations. I mean, it's the foundation. Classroom management and team management really aren't that different, but you can't fire your students, I suppose.
You're stuck with them.
Yeah, you're stuck with them. But it's funny, like I think that sometimes some of my staff joke that my title really shouldn't be brewmaster, it should be headmaster of the brewery. So I guess there's some part of teaching that's never left me.
What did you enjoy most about teaching?
The school I was at, and it's actually a nonprofit school that I'm now on the board of trustees of, is called the High Mountain Institute. And it's a nonprofit school in central Colorado that is one of these kind of experiential education programs. There's a handful of these like semester programs that exist that developed in like as part of the experiential ed movement in the 80s and 90s. And a lot of them are attached to existing prep schools where students would leave and go and do like farm work and academics for a semester, or like marine coastal biology and academic work. And so this one is in that same model, but the kind of key unique piece is that it's based on wilderness expeditioning. So as a teacher, you would both teach classes. I would teach academic classes, be involved in residential life because the students are all boarding students, and then also lead these backpacking, ski mountaineering, climbing expeditions, canyoneering. So that was pretty rad. So it was a very much a all immersive teaching and student community experience. And because of that, I think that helped, you experience your students and your students experience you as an educator in so many different roles. They don't ever they get to see you as a human being, and not as someone who they see in the classroom. And that to me is, and the same, vice versa for the students. You really see people and thrive in different environments. And to me, that was something that was really, really special about that. And that's what I like most.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, you look back on your high school career, even as a student, and you definitely silo people. You're like, this is my teacher. You don't think about their life outside of the school, for sure. But yeah, Colorado is such a huge beer producer, and so many craft breweries there.
And coming from the East Coast at the time, I mean, it was like my world just blew up. I mean, and, like Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, spending summers and spending my kind of childhood in Michigan, like I was, I knew Bell's and Founders and New Glarus and Summit and these kind of regional breweries in the Midwest, but getting to Colorado and experiencing, New Belgium and its kind of like early heyday, Odell, Oscar Blues as they were up and coming, Avery. I mean, these were breweries that a great divide that were just iconic for me and just really blew my mind.
Yeah. Cause was there a specific beer or any sort of beers that you tried in Colorado that like shaped that for you and made you like really push to want to do this more?
Oh yeah. I mean, the things, just the breadth of beers that were available, but a few that I remember. I mean, I remember touring New Belgium for the first time in 2000, and I want to say it was the fall of 2004, and having La Folie on tap there, which was, I think it was their first or second batch. And I had never had sour beer before, and much less a sour beer of that kind of accomplishment. And that just blew my mind. I would always, if I was flying back to Michigan, for the holidays or something to see my folks, I would always make sure to give myself an hour or so in Denver so I could go down to Falling Rock Tap House and have a couple of New Belgium beers before getting on the bus over to DIA and flying out, and it was just something that was really eye-opening for me.
Yeah, because I talked to another brewery owner in Madison, and he actually lived in Colorado too. Had a similar experience too, where it seems like you and him similarly were there at a time where it was like right before it just exploded. It was just like, now it's just like at a whole new crazy level. Yeah,
those years of like 04, 05, I think if you looked at the history of like kind of microbreweries in the US, like we saw this exponential growth in the late 90s, and then the market kind of fell out from underneath it. There's a lot of reasons for that, but a lot of people thought that there was this kind of big business opportunity and realized that brewing is more of a passion career than it is a money-making endeavor at times. And so a lot of breweries closed just when the financials didn't really pan out. Also, the market was way tinier than it is now. But by 2004, you're really starting to see some of these then established, at the time, probably 15-year-old breweries. Now they're 30-year-old breweries, but those kind of Gen 1.5, Gen 2 breweries of the craft beer movement start to really hit their stride. And that was an exciting time.
Yeah, and I know you weren't necessarily involved in any of those breweries, but like seeing them and their longevity and last, did you take any like mental notes of like how they were doing that? Because there's a lot of breweries that fail too, and yours have stood strong for years and years and years.
And I think exciting and diverse beers, right? I mean, that was the thing at the time. I mean, I hate to poo-poo where we're at this point in the beer world, but I mean, there was a time. Like, it's crazy to me to think that New Belgium, a brewery of even its size at the time of 70, 80,000 barrels, whatever they were probably larger than that, probably 150,000 barrels, would think that putting a beer to guard with Brettanomyces, I don't know how many of your listeners, viewers, or even know, what a beer to guard is, much less
probably not. I don't even know what it is.
Like a rustic French style and Belgian style kind of malty beer with a funky yeast that dries the beer out to champagne levels of carbonation and gives it kind of aromatics of like hay and dusty leather.
Gotcha.
The idea that that would be, and lemon verbena, like that would be a commercially viable beer, but they did it, and it's like people were willing to take those risks then. And now I think breweries across the board are a little, including even smaller breweries, are a little bit more, they assume the consumer palate is a little bit narrower in terms of what sells. And while at the pub level, you can do kind of that level of experimentation, you don't see it as wide in the marketplace anymore. The marketplace is narrowing in terms of what's there because consumers have said, well, we don't really want beer to guards and Brettanomyces, we want more IPAs. But that was an exciting time because it was so blue water and people really were just throwing anything at the wall they could to see what would stick, and it made being a drinker really exciting if you were into kind of tasting the rainbow.
I mean, I'm not a brewmaster or anything like that, but is that also partially maybe, is it like really tough to master different styles and make them really good? Like if you were really good at making like IPAs, is it tough to make like, or master like a Pilsner or something? You know what I mean? Is that tough to do?
Yeah. I mean, it certainly is. They're different skill sets. I mean, good brewing is good brewing, right? I mean, you have to, I think that good breweries make good beer. Like, and by that, I mean like breweries that have strong process, good raw materials handling, good fermentation management and healthy yeast, good packaging practices are going to make better beer on the whole than breweries that don't, right? Yeah. Regardless of the style. But when you're in that tier of breweries who have all these competencies, these kind of core competencies, yeah, you have to really get to that level of like mastery of a style. It takes a lot of discipline to do it for different things, and being a great brewer of IPAs certainly doesn't automatically make you a great brewer of big imperial stouts or pilsners or anything else. That you have to really kind of learn the style and learn how they work and learn the processes. And they're, it's all still the same. It's all liquid, but it's different.
Yeah. So because at Breakside, you make such a vast variety of different styles and in different ways. How long did it take you? I mean, I'm sure you're still learning now, but did it take like years and years and years to experiment and get into these different styles? Did you want to start with like a specific core style and branch out from there? How did that work?
Yeah, great question. Again, we were always going to be generalists. So I always wanted to kind of try and do a wide range of things. And some people might say that breadth sacrifices some area expertise. But, if you stick around long enough, you kind of build that up.
Yeah.
Being in the Northwest, and it's hoppy beers that keep the lights on. I mean, frankly, being a craft brewery in the United States in the 2010s and 2020s, IPA, whether West Coast or hazy, pale ale, session IPA, double IPA, I mean, hot forward American ales are what keep the lights on. So that became obviously something that we made a lot of and wanted to be really, really good at, right? Mm-hmm. That's always been a motto of kind of mantra with our brewery staff is like, if we can't be in the top tier of producers on a particular thing, we may as well pack up and just join the team down the street. Mm-hmm. That was certainly an ambition, was to get to that kind of like top level of hot forward beer producers. I would say that, like, again, going back to that concept of good breweries make good beer, like once you're in that, again, that you have that kind of baseline, it's not hard to make like okay Pilsner, right? Mm-hmm. It's not hard to make like a B level Pilsner. I think it's that like next 15% that's very, very difficult and takes years and years to make. And I think that like most of like what we've done in the last 5-7 years is take a lot of styles that we were at like kind of a B plus level and incrementally improve some of them. Not all of them, we've become better lager brewers in the last 2 or 3 years, but it's like these like tiny little jumps,
Yeah. What makes those tiny little jumps? Is it like different tweaks to like the process, different ingredients you're adding, things like that?
Yeah, both. I mean, it's process, it's yeast handling, it's understanding your raw materials better, it's sourcing the right raw materials, and not just buying blind from suppliers. I think those are probably the main things. I think raw materials and process are really what it boils down to once you have other good practices. But with like lager brewing, for example, changing fermentation regimes so that you can coax out different yeast profiles is a huge part of, I think, understanding that water profile and the way in which you mineralize different waters. I mean, this is technical, nerdy stuff, but those are the little incremental things that really can move the needle one way or another. Then you start looking at things, going down even the rabbit hole more, where it's not even about flavor and aroma anymore, but other aesthetics, right? Like, do we start filtering our lagers because that changes the mouthfeel slightly and makes you have a more pure hot malt experience, as opposed to having this like vague, very light protein level that coats the tongue and prevents you from tasting the malt as kind of acutely or as distinctly. Things like that just are fun to work on.
It's really cool to hear you talk about that, because I don't think people, most of the time, myself included, think about like how these little micro adjustments can really affect a process, and how that can change your drink and beer entirely. Because I've never brewed beer, so I have no idea.
Well, and it's not something that we can't really, I mean, I can talk about it in this forum, to you about it and to your listeners, but like we can't use that as like a selling point in the pub, because what happens, right, is that like the beer has to taste delicious. And so we have to do these kind of process adjustments in ways that make the beer more delicious. And that, like, I think people fundamentally, like consumers, know what they like and don't like. Mm-hmm. And if you can deliver, like, people may not even have these like conscientious responses to like an average IPA, but if they have a slightly below average IPA, they may just think, oh, I'm not going to order that again, or I'm not going to order that brew beer again. But if you can deliver something that like scratches that itch, that kind of optimizes deliciousness for someone, they may not even realize why they think it's that delicious, but they're going to order it again.
Yeah, no, for sure. I felt that way when I first drank your beers, honestly, is that,
that's very kind.
But no, it's interesting, because I think for a long time, and as a consumer, when you taste like a bunch of beers from different breweries, and then you taste like that one beer that you're like, this is how it should taste. This is amazing. It's like it like warps your mind in a very strange way. That it's amazing. I have What Rough Beast in my fridge right now. So
great.
That's my favorite beer, I think, all time.
Really?
Yeah.
So where are you right now, Pam? Are you in?
I'm in Portland.
You're in Portland. Okay, I didn't realize you were based here. Great. You must have cans then, I hope.
Yeah, I have cans.
Great. Yeah, the new cans they're tasting good.
But yeah, it was one of those things where I drank it and I'm like, this is incredible. I didn't know like that beer could taste like this. I mean, I feel like all of your awards and stuff really speak to that as well. It's not just me saying it, but yeah, to get to that point, even with a beer like that, where did that beer start and where has it come to now? Is that a beer that changed a lot or no?
It's definitely evolved, but that beer is actually not that different than how it looked on day one, I would say. So, let's see, gosh, I mean, how did we get into hazy IPA? That becomes a real long digression.
Go for it. Yeah.
So in 2015 or so, my partner and I, we were out in Boston. I went to Trillium Brewing. At the time, I had set up a meeting there with folks who run Trillium, and I hadn't been to the East Coast to Boston in many years, certainly New England many years, and had been reading about hazy IPAs online, but hadn't really experienced them, didn't really know what the story was. And I remember going to Trillium and tasting these beers, and they didn't even have a tap room at the time. They just were doing growlers to go, but hung out with them on their dock and in the brewery for a little bit, and they were tiny. This is back when they were just on, was it Front Street or Fort Street? Anyways, Fort Point. I was tasting the beers and I was like, oh, these just taste like, I kind of had this moment where I was like, oh, okay, I get it. Like, I see what people are into here. It's very low bitterness, much kind of like more protein heavy mouthfeel, kind of like pillowy, softer mouthfeel, and like a good bit of hop flavor, like in this kind of a fruitier hop flavor, but it's not as like citrusy, piney. There's still some of the dank elements of kind of, classic West Coast IPAs. To me, it was like kind of vaguely fruity, tropical, and a little bit dank. And so, I came back and wasn't really like, oh, we need to overhaul what we're doing with IPAs. But I remember designing another beer that we make, Rainbows and Unicorns, as kind of a first stab at something like that. In hindsight, of course, that beer is nothing like those beers and nothing like Walker Feast. But I think if you have that beer and understand, like, that was kind of like from a brewery who was going from making basically Wanderlust and Breakside IPA to understanding where the consumer palate and the brewer tendencies in making IPAs was going. Rainbows and Unicorns still to this day, which really has not evolved too much either. It's one of our favorite beers and just very distinct beer in our portfolio, is kind of maybe the middle point between old school, or not even old school, contemporary West Coast IPA and What Rough Beast. Of course, over the next then year and a half or so, maybe 2 years, hazy IPA took off, both nationwide, and people were going crazy for it. And so we started to understand more about like the yeast profiles that were involved in making it. And when we opened our Slabtown location, decided that, we hadn't really at that point made a hazy IPA in-house of our own. We'd done a few collaborations where we'd kind of worked through the ideas, but we said, this is our opportunity. We're opening this new pub in Northwest Portland. It's going to be a hop-forward focused pub. We're going to open with a hazy IPA on tap. There's a beer called Something Wicked, and it was basically the beta version of what became What Rough Beast. And we would have probably called it Something Wicked, which was a nice, Wicked Boston reference, but also, Something Wicked This Way Comes. There's kind of a menacing effect to it, but there's a Something Wicked brewery in Pennsylvania. So we couldn't properly use that name. So after much brainstorm, we settled on What Rough Beast, which is a Yates reference. But yeah, that beer really evolved as kind of our first, we're like, okay, we think we have a sense of how these beers are made, what the bitterness is like, what the body is like, what the gravity and yeast profile is like. We kind of shot at it. And I think where we landed in 2017 was this beer that was, I would describe it as being appropriately a Northeast IPA, a hazy New England IPA, but through the lens of a Northwest brewer's palate. Because that beer is a little bit drier, a little bit more bitter, a little bit more, I would say, West Coast hop. This is a weird word. We say pellety often. Like it smells more like fresh hot pellets than it does like orange juice. And so interestingly, I think that was we inadvertently landed on something that no one was doing at the time. It wasn't full New England, but it definitely wasn't West Coast. And we've kind of embraced that. We have changed the beer a little bit to, I think, make the hop aroma move a little bit more toward kind of tropical juicy, but it's still fundamentally the same. It's a little drier than most hazy IPAs out there. It's very hazy still, so it doesn't lack in mouthfeel, but it also has just a touch more bitterness. And, I think that suits the consumer palate out here. I mean, that's one thing. Oh, sorry, I'm really going on a digression about hazy IPA here. But, in New England, there was no tradition of enjoying IPA, pre-2015. I mean, Harpoon IPA was caramely and bitter and non-aromatic, as were most of the other iconic, quote-unquote iconic IPAs of the East Coast, but they were the laughing stock of the beer world, of the craft beer world. I mean, California, the Northwest, Colorado, even the Midwest were just making IPAs that were beautiful, aromatic, admittedly quite bitter, but were just, no one took New England East Coast IPA seriously. And so there was also not much of a consumer culture around IPA in the Northeast. That's why when hazy IPA came along and New England IPA came along, it was kind of blue water for folks, they didn't have to, they could go for this very soft, very underbittered version of IPA. But in the Northwest, fortunately, people always liked IPA. People were buying West Coast IPA. It's not like people thought IPA was a bad thing. People loved it. It was their top selling beer for, since day one, as it is for most breweries. And so people like bitterness. It's interesting. There's definitely a regional palate on the West Coast that appreciates a level of bitterness that still persists through all these iterations of hazy IPA and shifts in kind of overall balance in beers.
When they were quote unquote the laughing stock of the brewery industry, do they still make those types of beers, or have those beers been wiped off and changed?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm sure there's some breweries who still make those beers. A Harpoon IPA, and I don't really want to, I'm not trying to be mean to the Harpoon guys. Yeah. It's probably the most well-known example of a pre-New England IPA. And I think a lot of people would point to it and say, there's all the things that people didn't like about IPA in it.
Yeah.
Caramely, non-aromatic, bitter, dry. Some of that stuff is good if you balance it right? But anyways, I don't know if, I know that beer still gets made, but, you go into New England, honestly, and you order an IPA and it's going to be hazy, in my experience. There's not a lot of, maybe there will eventually be a resurgence of modern West Coast IPA. There, but I think, but not at the moment that I've observed. Maybe someone can correct me on that. But in the Southeast, there is. If you move, down the Atlantic seaboard toward North Carolina and Florida in particular, you find some really good West Coast style IPAs, classic American IPAs that are not necessarily hazies.
So when did you actually move to Portland, in Oregon from Colorado?
Summer of 2008.
So it was 2 years, and then you started the brewery, right? 2 years of living here, and then
so I'm not one of the original founders of Breakside. Breakside was started by two guys, Tony and Scott. They basically decided to form an LLC in the fall of 2009, and I met them about 3 months later.
Okay.
So this was late 2009, very early 2010. We disagree on what the dates were when I first met Scott, but yeah, they brought me on as their future brewer at that point. And I'd gone to brewing school in the meantime. I'd moved to Portland, left Portland to go to brewing school and then come back. Was searching for a job, had been planning to open a different brew pub with a couple of friends, but that fell through, and got connected with those guys. And so when they were getting off the ground, that was when I came on board. And so about 6 months later was when we opened.
So at that time, what did the brewery scene, because that was 11 years ago now, what did the brewery scene look like in Portland then compared to, because now were you
living here then?
No.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, I think people, if I told you that the top IPAs in town, if you walked into bars around town,
mm-hmm.
the most sought after IPAs were like Double Mountain Hop Lava, Hopworks IPA, Laurelwood, Workhorse. Like those were the kind of most highly sought after. And then RPM came from Boneyard, and that just completely dominated the scene in a way that nothing had done. That was 2010, 2011. The other thing that was interesting about Portland's beer scene, at that time, is that we were starting to see this transition between they're really up until 2008, 9, other than the Horse Brass, there really just weren't as many tap houses. Belmont Station moved to its current location with the beer cafe and having expanded its taps. I want to say in early 2008. Cerveza 2008 or 9, Beer Mongers, Apex, Concordia Ale House, the Green Dragon. They're all kind of opening in that period. Victory Bar, Roscoe's had been open for a couple of years, but Montevilla was kind of outside the central, a little bit out of the way. Bailey's opened, I think, in 2007 or 2008. So all of a sudden, you had this influx of new bars that were beer centric, that were really committed to giving small new breweries a platform and rotating taps too, and so that was a key change, I think, in the Portland beer landscape at the time. Because before that, it was very much brew pub based. There were a lot of McMenamin's pubs, the Lucky Lab pubs, the Lompoc pubs, and talking to friends who lived here before, who were either from Portland or who moved here before I did, they would say that, up until that point, really it was, you went to those pubs much more than you went to beer bars. And the beer bar concept was pretty novel and new at the time.
So yeah, I mean, that basically gave the stage for more breweries to pop up and be spread out throughout Portland, I would assume.
Yeah. I mean, Portland already had a ton of brew pubs and small breweries, but the fact that then you could have your brew pub and then sell a small amount of beer to these rotator beer bars was pretty cool concept, and gave you this additional exposure, that you wouldn't have had otherwise. And in theory, that was kind of our marketing budget at the time.
Yeah. When it was first starting, I know you talked about wanting to be a more generalist, but was there specific beers or was there debate over which beers you wanted to put out first to, I guess, make sure that consumers really loved what you were doing?
There was kind of an early conversation around what kind of our core beers would be. The idea early on was that we would keep a light beer, a dark beer, an IPA, and kind of a hoppy-ish red beer on. That those would be the 4 main beers, as well as a strong ale, actually, with chocolate and chilies called, at the time it's called Aztec Ale, which we don't make anymore really, or very rarely. I was brewing on a 3-barrel system when we opened up Deacom, right? And it's still the system that we use there. So we couldn't even keep all of the taps. We have 12 taps there. We couldn't keep them all filled with our own beer. So we were supplementing, usually if you walked in, say, circa middle of 2011 to early 2012, you walk into the Deacom pub, there might be 6 of our beers on, but 6 guest taps as well. So yeah, we were just trying to keep those few beers, those core brands on, core brands, quote unquote, mainline brands, and then a few additional ones that we'd rotate through. But even from then, because we couldn't fill the full tap list, we were, rotating. We were trying new stuff all the time. And that was, I think, actually, we weren't trying to do that as a market strategy, but that was definitely something that other breweries were not doing yet. The idea that a brewery would make 45, 50, 100 beers in a year now is kind of de rigueur. You can't just make 9 beers and expect that to be your entire portfolio and maintain cachet in the marketplace. But like in 2010, 2011, the idea that you would make that many beers would suggest that you're just kind of like throwing everything, you're not really disciplined, or you don't know what you're doing, or like, how can customers know what they're drinking or remember what they're drinking? And I think we were ahead of the curve, or at the forefront of that curve. But again, it wasn't necessarily by some sort of strategy. It was more just by interest. And we came by it honestly.
I was always curious about that with such a complex and high amounts of beers in your arsenal. Everybody's favorite beer is on that list, and so how do you manage like which ones you rotate through and when you stop and start, and how does that work?
Well, yeah, I wish I had like a great, it's like there's no grand unifying theory of it. I mean, a lot of it is dictated by, so I oversee our 2 brew pubs that are over, the brewers who oversee our 2 brew pubs, and I work very closely in terms of the developing of like the pub side beers, right? So what you might find if you go to Slabtown or the Deacon Pub, as well as down, at our production brewery, the kind of small batch stuff that you'll find there. And so a lot of that is about just kind of revisiting things that we're interested in, things that have sold well, batches that we like, concepts that we like. Occasionally we'll get customer feedback about like, hey, you guys haven't made this in forever. When is this coming back? And we'll always try and be responsive to that, and it might take 3 or 4 months before we're working into the schedule. But, we have a pretty good sense of like when things kind of gain some traction with consumers, especially our regulars at the pubs. We try and, definitely, I think anyone who's a fan of Breakside and comes to the pub regularly knows that there are going to be a bunch of new things on, and then a few old standards on. And that's kind of why that's part of our charm for them, or the attraction for them. But in terms of like doing it at the production level, a lot of it, is just dictated by consumer response. I always say we're incredibly lucky at Breakside because we have tanks that range from 90 gallons to 4,000 gallons. And, we can make any scale batches anywhere in between there. So like, 90, 180, I think 310, 620, all the way up to 4,000. And so part of my job is just to make sure we isn't necessarily to decide what we don't make. It's to make sure that we make the right amount of beer so that it sells, And if we think something needs to go up or down, it's easy to scale.
Because you guys have won so many awards for so many different beers. What was the first award that you won for a beer?
Yeah. I very much, it was a pretty fun moment. It was the Great American Beer Festival 2011. We won a silver medal for our Irish Stout, which was the kind of the house dark beer. It was one of those 4 or 5 core brands that we made. So that was kind of cool. Yeah.
What was your reaction to that?
We had never entered any beer competitions before. Yeah. I had no idea. Of course it was thrilling, You're like, holy, like, oh my gosh, I can't believe they called our name. My friend Sean Kelso, who's the one of the brewmasters now at 10 Barrel, he was at Barley Browns at the time. He said he's like, I've seen you win a lot of awards over the years, but like that was the happiest I've ever seen you, at any award ceremony. He's like, you guys were so thrilled. I was like, yeah, it's pretty. He's like, that's so cool. Like that, to see people win their first medal is like so amazing, No, we were definitely like one of those moments where people are like, hey, you have to go up on stage. Like you're really excited. You got to get up there. You're holding the line.
Yeah, no, that's so cool. because now it's sort of become like, you've won just so many. I feel like everything you make is like touching gold a little bit, like you guys.
Thank you. It's not 100% true, but yeah.
Close. It's 90%. But yeah, so moving forward, you guys have expanded, and as you said, you have a location on Decum and also a production facility in Milwaukee, and things are getting bigger. Is there, you've done really well in the pandemic, I'm assuming, or good enough?
Surviving, which is good enough, right? Yeah.
Yeah. Where do you plan on like taking it in the future?
Well, so we have a couple new locations that we're opening this year. We're opening a new tap room in Beaverton, right in
cool.
Beaverton. That'll be no brewery on site. It'll be the first time we just do a straight up tap room. We will have food carts there, big German style beer garden. It's going to be really cool. We're also going to open a small tap room down in Lake Oswego, right next to Salt and Straw there, right off the lake. And so 2 areas where we have been kind of eyeing tap rooms for a long time and had some good opportunities that we were approached about. And so both those are going to happen sometime this June or July. they'll be open. And then we're also a couple of years ago, we renovated a 1972 Winnebago. And of course, that was going to be like rented out for events and whatnot. But since COVID happened, there's no events. So we decided to convert that into the beer trailer at a new cart pod called The Core, which is at 82nd and Lafayette, I believe. So just south of Powell. And that should be open in the next couple of weeks, actually.
Wow.
So that would be the beer cart, I guess, or Winnebago for that food cart pod. So those are kind of the immediate plans that people will be able to visit, in the next couple months. The other thing is, we're just at the production level and as a brewery and as a business, just trying to get back to our pre-pandemic numbers. We were going into March of 2020, we were 7 out of every 10 beers that we sold was draft beer,
Oh, wow.
Now that calculus is completely flipped. Right now, it's the complete opposite. Now, 70% of what we do is, if not more, is packaged beer, cans and bottles. And so we're just trying to. That's a huge identity shift for us.
Yeah.
Obviously, now that bars are reopening, restaurants are reopening, we hope that we're going to see a big upswing in draft sales again as well. We love being a draft brewery. I love having draft beer around Portland, and so it'll be interesting to see where where we land in 3 or 4 months on all of that. So definitely been a kind of a big swerve in what we do, and trying to kind of adjust to being a packaging brewery more. That changes your labor, it changes your labor distribution, it changes the way in which what your costs, all sorts of things, what your supply chains are for stuff like literally trying to source aluminum cans is incredibly way more difficult than getting kegs for draft beer. So there's lots of little challenges that we're facing, and just trying to reach some sense of normalcy in the production level. And hopefully by the end of this year, we'll kind of be back to a good rhythm like we were pre-pandemic.
Yeah, I've heard that from someone else too, that sourcing aluminum cans is really difficult.
Yeah, there's a big shortage right now. There are only a handful of can manufacturing facilities in the United States, and they're basically completely booked out. A lot of it has to do with the fact that a lot of soda has gone to cans, cola and things like that.
Yeah.
Big upswings in their can sales. And so, of course, they're able to leverage their way into that supply chain better than small breweries.
Yeah, it's amazing to hear though that it was 7 out of 10 was draft sales. I mean, I've heard draft sales from other brewers are the best thing because you obviously don't have to package and worry about any of that stuff. So that flip had to be tremendously hard.
Yeah, it was a difficult first few months for sure. And then fortunately, as things reopened last summer, the small amount of draft we got back helped us kind of stabilize through the summer and, through the end of summer. And fresh hop season was always, despite the fires of past years, always a really good season for us because people came out in force to drink fresh hop beer, harvest hop beer. And at the same time, we pulled the trigger on getting a canning line. We had done some canning with mobile canning before, but again, it was a small amount of what we were doing.
Yeah.
When you're working with a third-party outfit, you can't can that much. And for a brewery who was, we were doing 30,000 barrels, which again, think of that as 82 barrels a day.
Wow.
Is that's 20,000 pints of beer a day.
Whoa.
So across, that's what that was what we were selling. Obviously, when you're that volume, you can't just call up someone to say, hey, we need 20,000 cans every day of the week.
Yeah.
A, they don't have the supply, and B, they are already booked up by other people. And so, we needed to get our own canning line to be able to meet the demand, right? And supply the demand.
Yeah.
Now we have that. That's been in now for a handful of months. That's why you've seen beers like What Rough Beast go from 22-ounce bottles to 16-ounce cans. Breakside IPA, Wanderlust, also both in cans now. So our main core brands are in 16-ounce cans. We literally this week just did 12-ounce cans for the first time. So Rainbows and Unicorns and True Gold, both of which used to be in 12-ounce bottles, are now in 12-ounce cans. And it'll take a few weeks for all the last batch of bottles to get out of the market, but you'll start seeing those in 12-ounce cans as well.
Yeah, that's a crazy amount. To reflect on that number a day that's so much beer. That's insane.
It's incredibly humbling, to think that there are people who make that that many people make that choice every day. and only 5% of that is employees. So
yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for coming on. When things start to reopen again, I'm for sure gonna visit a tap room and
please do. Yeah, when you come by.
Yeah. So thank you so much for taking the time. I love the beer.
Thanks for letting me tell my story a little bit and talk about Breakside a little bit. This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thank you, man.
All right. Cheers.